Of course, now as we move into the Dharma Talk, this is a great time to do what I call getting the wiggles out. Feel free to stretch. Often when we enter into our meditation, we make some discoveries. We discover things about our mind and our body. So we may have some new awareness and want to offer that kind stretching and shifting to our bodies. Last week, Victor quoted Jack Kornfield saying, "Notice what you notice. Notice what you notice." Habitual patterns of noticing that we all carry. Certain things become more salient to us over time. We're repeatedly drawn to them. And back in the early days of the pandemic, I noticed that I was doing something in modern terminology called doom scrolling. I have a feeling when people were using paper scrolls, there was a variation of it even way back then. But we have modern scrolling technology, and I was doing that. And I realized that for my mental health, I needed to figure out a different way to interact with the news. And so what I did is, and I've done this ever since, I just get 2 digest emails, one from the New York Times to be national, and then one to keep it local, KCUR's public radio digest email. And so I just kind of read the headlines, and I try to be conscious about what I really read in depth and just pick maybe 1 or 2 things. And it's been an interesting exercise to notice what I notice. And I know that a lot of you didn't come here to hear news stories, but I am going to talk about one that it definitely has caught my attention multiple times, and it's uncomfortable news. So, if you need to kind of la for a minute, totally understood. But there's lots of news that's been weighing on my heart, but this is something it's come up repeatedly, and I found myself reading this in depth. And it's the news of multiple, not just one, not just 2, multiple unmarked mass graves, mostly bearing the remains of children being discovered in several provinces in Canada. At least 3 former boarding schools for Indigenous children. Estimates are now ranging into more than 1,000 bodies. And these were children from the Ktunaxa nations, the Penelakut nations, the Sewempic nations, and many others. And so why did I notice this? Right, it's not the only news, but why did my heart really respond to this? Well, one reason is just the horrific nature of it. It's just a rather intense piece of news. And also because it's not ancient history. We may think that it is, but at least one of these boarding schools was in operation as recently as 1997. That's very real for me. Some of these schools are very recent, but also there's another reason I had to realize, and that's because I used to live right here in the metropolitan area of Kansas City. I used to live 1 block from the Shawnee Indian Mission, which predates all those Canadian schools, because the Canadian boarding school system was modeled on the US. People actually came down from Canada to see how it was being done. And I used to walk by the Shawnee Indian Mission, and it took me a while. When I first moved to that neighborhood, I didn't understand. I didn't understand the history, the legacy, the very painful legacy. Children from the Shawnee, Delaware, Kaw. For those of you who live in this region, you know these names. Kansas, the town of Kansas, of the Kaw Indians. As I saw this news, I thought, well, what was I walking over when I walked those grounds? What would we find if we brought that technology here that they used to discover? And it has always been very, very tempting for me to turn away from that news, the way that I had to limit my news intake, but even limiting it, sometimes I just don't want to know at all. I just want to turn it all off. And that's a strategy, and it can be a successful strategy. It can be. But it's only a short-term strategy. I'm sure we have all had experiences in our life where there has been a source of discomfort, of pain. We don't have the choice. There is no option to turn off the phone, to turn off the news, to turn off the radio. We can't turn away from it. And so it's important, I think it's been important for me, I can speak personally, to cultivate ways to deal with that discomfort and pain, to process it when I don't have the choice to turn away from it. But before I talk about that, I want to talk about why. Why do we want to turn away? We want to armor our hearts. So I want to share the story of Avalokiteshvara, and if you're, some of you may be more familiar with him in female form as Kuan Yin, especially if you've been to the Nelson Museum in Kansas City. They have a really fabulous Kuan Yin statue. But before he traveled and changed gender and became Kuan Yin, he was originally historically known as Avalokiteshvara, the Bodhisattva of compassion. And he has a story with Tara the Liberator, the female Buddha. She's often known as the mother of Buddhas. And Avalokiteshvara, he knew there was a lot of pain out there. And he decided that before he would enter enlightenment, become a Buddha, he was going to unceasingly work to liberate all beings. And he made a vow in front of all the beings, the bodhisattvas, the Buddhas, and everyone else. He said, if I falter in this task for even one moment, may I shatter into 1,000 pieces. And with this, shall we say, enthusiastic effort, he began to liberate. And he just kept going, but there was one moment when he sort of peered down, right? It's like you're standing at the edge of the cliff and people just say, don't look down and it'll be fine. Well, Avalokiteshvara, he looked down and he saw all the beings that remained. And for one moment, he lost heart. He faltered and he shattered. But all the Buddhas and the Bodhisattvas, they had seen his vow and they were so moved by his effort, they immediately came in and they put him back together again. They healed him back into wholeness. And once he was whole again, he began to weep. Just tears flowed. He said, how could I have faltered? I'm so sad that I did that. And from one of his tears sprang Tara the Liberator, the mother of Buddhas. And she said, oh dear, don't cry. Don't cry. You don't have to do it all alone. We'll do it together. And so in that way, Avalokiteshvara was transformed and joined forces and continued that process of liberation. So what can we learn from this story? Well, with all of these great stories, right, they're working on multiple levels. They have many, many things to tell us. So this is just one thing we might see, which is, why do we turn away from the pain? Why do we want to turn off the news, numb out to ourselves, our own experience? Because we see what happened. We are afraid that, like Avalokiteshvara, we will falter or that we will shatter. But more importantly, we're afraid no one will be there to put us back together and that we will remain alone in our struggle. But this story suggests otherwise. It suggests that if we can open to that shattering, that we won't remain in that state, we will be transformed. And so, yes, turning away, armoring our hearts, it does work in the short term, but only for a little bit. And it has some big disadvantages. Number one is it doesn't just keep out the bad stuff, it keeps out the good stuff too. And if you want evidence of this, just think about the fact that we often talk about breaking hearts happening because of joy, not just pain. Right? We talk about, oh, I was so happy I thought my heart would burst. But the armored heart can't contain that joy, just like it can't let in the pain. And also, if we look at the truth teachings, the wisdom teachings of the world, we see that this armor is really an artificial limitation. The true nature of the heart is limitless. So this armor puts a false limit there. So what can we do? What can we do? How can we remove this armor and reclaim that true vastness of our heart space? Well, first, we probably need to proceed cautiously, gently. Maybe we don't want to go at it with the ferocity of Avalokiteshvara. I have this image of the closet that's been packed full. You don't just want to fling that door open because you could get hurt in the process of everything tumbling out. But, the idea is that we can proceed at a gentle pace. The other reason we might not want to go too fiercely is think about, if you've ever had an injury, especially broken bones, those in the old days they used to always do the hard casts and you couldn't move that body part, and then it's not like the cast came off and you could just go back to doing what you were doing before. You had to rebuild the muscles and everything. Well, if our heart has been encased in that hard armor and we just all of a sudden take it off, we can't expect it to have the strength, the flexibility, all the capacity that it had before that armor was on. So that's why we want to go gently. So once we've acknowledged that we're going to move onto this path at a gentle pace of opening this armor, the first step is to settle the mind. And that, we see that right in the Eightfold Path. It's called skillful concentration. And we just did it. We do it every week. We come here and we sit and we take some time to be in silence, to just let all that muck and mud that is stirred up in the pond just settle a little bit so that we can see a little bit more clearly. Because that muck and mud, that's part of the armor. It's what keeps us from not knowing what's going on down there. Right? Oh, I don't want to see. But if we can let that settle, that helps us see what's going on so that we can respond to it appropriately instead of being blindsided. So that's step one. And it's important to know, I want to make this really clear, two things. Number one, we don't have to let the mind settle 100% to proceed to the next step. But also, sometimes we think that settling the mind requires turning off the mind, that the thinking mind is somehow a bad thing and we should only be operating from intuition and our heart. But just a little thought experiment, speaking of thinking mind, we're in this amazing building with electric lights, air conditioning. I have hearing aids that let me hear you and interact with you. You're sitting on this amazing furniture. Somebody had to think about how to make all this. All of these things are results of thinking minds. That's a valuable tool. But like all tools, there's a time and a place for it, right? So we want to use the right tool for the job. So the thinking mind is good, but sometimes we just need to set it aside. It's not the right tool for the job. So let things settle. And then we can move on to the next step, and that is practicing opening the heart, right? Building that heart strength. And the good news is we do that every week here at Temple Buddhist Center. We end every service with metta practice. And we chanted at the beginning of today's service about several different aspects of cultivating heart capacity. So metta is often translated as goodwill, loving kindness for ourselves and others. And then there is karuna, it's compassion. It's that heart capacity that lets us see the pain and discomfort of others, but not be overwhelmed by it, but also return and understand, feeling that connection and offering support. Mudita, sympathetic joy. A win for one is a win for all of us because we begin to understand the way we're connected. And then upekkha, or equanimity. Sometimes I refer to this as openness or receptivity. And this is what allows us to move through the world with a heart that doesn't get stuck, that allows the blood and the oxygen to move freely, right? Letting our experience move freely. And so we can cultivate these many different ways to practice and cultivate these qualities. Metta is just one of them. And then there's a third step. So we've settled the mind, we've begun to open the heart. And from that place, that's where wisdom can arise. And when we have that wisdom, when we have access to it, the third thing is what we're really doing when we move beyond these doors here at TBC. It's acting. It's how do we act in the world? And teacher Spring Washam, the founder of the East Bay Meditation Center, a very, very skilled teacher, she talks about how in any given moment, there is a skillful level of action for that particular moment. And again, this goes back to the Eightfold Path, right? Skillful action is one of the items on the path. So we've got this wisdom that can inform us what is the right level of action for us right now in this particular moment. And it may be personal. It may be just sitting and doing nothing. That is an action, taking the time to settle and open. It may be personal reflection, education. It may be interpersonal, sharing, listening. It may be institutional. It may be conscious activism. We need to get out and get on the front lines and make some change. Or maybe we need to provide some backline support. Maybe we're making sandwiches in the kitchen for the people who are on the front line. Maybe we're making phone calls to tell people where the front line is. Or maybe we need to read and reflect so we understand why there's a front line in the first place. So that action is not one size fits all. And what's skillful and the level of skillfulness, the level of action that is called for may change moment to moment. But we need all three steps. We need all three steps to truly, truly act and be from a place of openness. And so I invite you to remember to keep in your hearts that story of Avalokiteshvara and Tara. And remember that this process of opening, settling, acting, we can do it enthusiastically, but we don't need to do it alone. And it's likely that we will falter. And the more enthusiastic we go, the more likely we are to hit those shattering moments. But that is why we have the jewel of the Sangha, to know that we will have something to pick us back up and to walk on the path together. I want to leave you with the words of Lisa Wapepa of the Lakota Nation. She says, I know this path is hard. I know this path is hard. But there's something harder than this path. What's harder than this path is not having a path. And so my own wish for us all, everywhere, is that as we travel this path, with each step, may our hearts open wider and wider until they are wider even than this vast sky under which we all walk together.